My wedding day shocker. The secret journal that changed everything. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I was in my perfect white dress, walking down the aisle to marry the man I loved. But 2 days before, I found my mother's secret journal. A journal that detailed her 3-month affair with my fiancé, Ethan, and their plan to continue it even after we said I do. I had a choice. Call it off quietly, or use my wedding day to serve the ultimate justice. I chose the altar. You have to see the moment I expose their betrayal to 200 stunned guests. This is my story.
My fiancé betrayed me with my own stepmother just days before our wedding, but what I did next astonished every guest. My name is Vera, and I'm 32 years old. Right now, I'm standing at the altar of Aethelred Hall, wearing a custom sapphire-blue gown I designed, surrounded by 300 guests who are completely unaware of the scandal that's about to erupt. The heavy velvet feels smooth against my skin, and the hall's massive chandeliers cast a sparkling glow across the polished oak floor. My bouquet of purple irises is completely still in my hands, but not from nerves about marriage. I'm rigid because in exactly 48 hours, my meticulously built world shattered into pieces. My father, Henry, stands beside me, his arm linked firmly with mine, his face controlled, yet filled with quiet fury. He knows what I know now. He's the only one who does. In the front row, my mother, Vivian, sits perfectly composed in her emerald green dress, delicately touching her eyes with a silk scarf as if she is the model of a proud, tearful maternal figure. Next to me, my fiancé, Ethan, smooths his waistcoat nervously, flashing that charismatic smile that once made my heart race. Now it makes my resolve harden. The string quartet music fills the grand hall as guests politely murmur among themselves, admiring the opulent decorations my mother insisted on curating. Deep red peonies everywhere, exactly as she demanded, the same flowers she specifically noted as her favorite in the digital messages about him, about their clandestine meetings. I graduated with high honors with a degree in architectural engineering from the University of Edinburgh. I work as a lead project manager at Cromwell & Sons Building, one of the most respected construction firms in the city of Glasgow, Scotland. I've built a life I value, a career that is significant, and relationships I believed in, or at least I thought I had. My father is Lord Albright, a respected High Court judge known for his fairness and wisdom across the Caledonian region. Ironically, he taught me to uphold truth above all else. My fiancé comes from the affluent Ramsay family. New wealth, political ties, the kind of lineage that looks unimpeachable on paper and in high society journals. 4 years ago, when he proposed during a boat cruise on Loch Lomond while we were watching a fireworks display, I thought I was living a romance novel. The brilliant lights exploded overhead as he knelt with a 5-carat sapphire ring, and everyone on our deck cheered and watched. It was cinematic, faultless, everything I'd envisioned since I was a young girl. The wedding preparations started immediately. My mother threw herself into every single task with an obsessive zeal that should have been my first sign of trouble. She insisted on choosing the caterer, the linens, the seating plan, even my hairstylist. When I suggested alternate choices, she'd get this wild look in her eyes, defensive, almost hysterical, and declare things like, "My dearest, trust me, I know what is suitable for the family name." I assumed she was just being an overzealous mother, trying to make a grand social statement through my wedding day. Now I realize she was directing the wedding where she'd watch the man she was intimate with marry her stepdaughter. The string quartet begins the bridal chorus, and I take my first step down the long aisle. Each footstep is absorbed by the plush carpet, and I can feel 300 pairs of eyes focused on me. Some guests beam and nod cordially, others discreetly dab their eyes, thinking they're witnessing an epic romance. They have no idea they're about to be spectators to something utterly unexpected. My bouquet holds a small, significant detail tucked carefully between the irises. Several printed transcripts of my mother's encrypted chat logs. The digital proof that destroyed my reality 2 days ago. The transcripts where she outlined every secret rendezvous with my fiancé, every lie they told me, every cynical scheme they made to continue their sordid affair after today. As I walk toward the altar, I'm not the idealistic girl who believed in flawless love and storybook conclusions. I'm a woman who discovered that sometimes the people you rely on most are capable of the most profound deceptions. And sometimes the only path to reclaiming your independence is to decide not to be a casualty of their malice. The wedding march continues, and with every deliberate step, I'm moving toward the moment when I'll reveal to everyone exactly who they truly are. 4 months ago, I thought I had everything settled. I woke up every morning in my spacious flat in the West End, drove to work at Cromwell and Sons, where I oversaw blueprints that would become major city developments, and came home to plan the most extravagant wedding with the man I genuinely thought was my lifelong companion. My daily routine was structured and predictable. Strong black coffee at 6:30, a quick review of construction news, then the drive to my site office, where I spent hours immersed in the logistics of other people's projects. I specialized in large-scale commercial developments, particularly projects requiring complex structural integrity. The poetic irony is not lost on me now. I was an expert at finding structural faults and design flaws in buildings, but completely blind to them in my own life. My fiancé worked at Caledonian Financial, a prominent investment house in Edinburgh. He specialized in high-risk commodities trading, bringing in a 7-figure income that allowed us to plan the kind of wedding that graces the cover of glossy Scottish magazines. We'd been a couple for 4 years, living in separate but adjacent cities, yet spending most weekends together, talking about buying a historic estate in the Perthshire Hills once we were married. The proposal had been truly magnificent. During the boat cruise's firework display, he'd excused himself, claiming he was getting a fresh drink. Instead, a spotlight suddenly lit our specific area, and there he was, on one knee, with a ring that reflected the brilliant colors like a small galaxy. The entire surrounding crowd turned to watch as I said yes, happiness overwhelming me. Even now, despite everything, I remember how breathtaking that moment felt. My mother celebrated with great enthusiasm that night. She embraced him so passionately, I had to gently intervene and pull her back, jokingly mentioning she was acting like she was the one getting married. She insisted we celebrate at her favorite exclusive members club, the one with the hidden velvet-lined booths and a vintage port selection she knew intimately. She ordered a bottle of port that cost more than my monthly car payment, declaring nothing was too good for her future son-in-law. The wedding planning consumed our lives for months. Every free weekend meant vendor meetings, tailor fittings, menu selection, site visits, and countless calls with planners. My mother assigned herself as the supreme coordinator, creating exhaustive schedules and contact lists that rivaled a military operation. She held strong opinions about everything, from the shade of ivory for the invitations to the specific blend of spirits for the signature cocktail. When I suggested having the rehearsal dinner at a local pub instead of the exclusive club she'd chosen, she became almost frantic.
Darling, Aethelred Hall demands a certain level of sophistication, and the food there is so much more suitable for your guests. This is your one monumental day. Vivian had an unshakable justification for everything, always delivered with such strong authority that I often just consented to maintain the peace. My fiancé, Ethan, seemed oddly hands-off for a man planning his own wedding. When I'd ask his preference about musical selections or entree choices, he'd simply smile and say, "Whatever makes you and Vivian content." I assumed he was being supportive, allowing the women to handle the traditionally domestic aspects of the planning. Now I know he was allowing my mother to plan their ultimate fantasy event. Work became my shelter from the wedding storm. At Cromwell and Sons, I felt capable and respected. My boss consistently praised my negotiating skills, and developers specifically requested me for complex contracts. I was building something that was unequivocally mine, completely separate from my identity as someone's daughter or wife-to-be. But even at work, the wedding intruded. My mother would call daily with updates and urgent inquiries. "The florist needs to know if you prefer the French lace or the Italian silk ribbon on the pew ends. The event manager is asking about the preferred brand of single malt whiskey for Ethan's family." Always pressing, always demanding immediate answers. Looking back, I should have questioned why my mother was so knowledgeable about my fiancé's family's expensive habits, why she seemed to have his work travel itinerary committed to memory, why she always knew exactly which expensive wine he preferred when we dined out together. The first time I noticed a genuine inconsistency, I blamed it on pre-wedding stress affecting my judgment. It was a Friday evening in late spring, about 2 months before the wedding date. I'd stopped by my mother's apartment to drop off the final seating chart mock-up, and I noticed my fiancé's sport car parked discreetly around the corner. When I walked into the sitting room, they were standing much closer than seemed necessary, both holding glasses of aged scotch and laughing at some private, intimate joke. My mother's complexion was flushed, and she had that youthful glow in her eyes that I hadn't seen since before she married my father, Henry, years ago. "Oh, Vera, dear," she exclaimed, taking a quick step away from him. "We were just confirming the final guest list. Your fiancé had such excellent suggestions about the placement of the business dignitaries." Ethan smiled that powerful smile and gave me a quick peck on the forehead. "Your mother has unbelievable organizational skills. I was just telling her how fortunate you are to have someone so completely dedicated to making your day flawless." They seemed to exchange a whole silent conversation with their eyes before my mother rushed over to the minibar. "Let me get you some scotch, honey. We acquired this exquisite bottle from that rare collection in London. Your fiancé selected it. He said it's exactly the style you'd appreciate." The scotch was indeed excellent. It was from a limited distillery I'd mentioned loving during a recent business trip I'd taken 8 months earlier, but I'd never mentioned it to my mother. I'd barely even remembered mentioning it myself. "How did you know about that specific distillery?" I asked Ethan directly. He exchanged another guarded look with my mother before answering, "You mentioned it, remember? Last month when we were discussing the honeymoon budget." I didn't recall that exchange at all, but the wedding planning had become such a confusing blur that I decided I must have simply forgotten. That was my first monumental error, choosing to trust instead of probing. The suspicious events became more frequent as the wedding date approached. I'd call my mother and hear a deep masculine chuckle in the background before she'd quickly explain that my father, Henry, was watching a comedy on the television. But my father was usually in his chambers during those times, preparing legal opinions or meeting with associates. One Sunday afternoon, I arrived at my mother's home unannounced to drop off a bespoke gift for my father. I found her in the main lounge, disheveled in a manner I'd never witnessed. Her usually immaculate hair was a mess, her lipstick was smudged, and she was wearing a silk dressing gown at 3 in the afternoon. "Vera, I wasn't expecting you," she stammered, pulling the gown tightly around herself. "I called 30 minutes ago," I replied, utterly confused. "You told me to come over." "Oh, yes, of course. I was just taking a deep rest. Wedding administration is utterly exhausting." But the coffee table held 2 fine china teacups, both recently used, and I could faintly smell an expensive, musky cologne in the air. Not my father's classic scent. One of the teacups had a faint lipstick mark that perfectly matched my mother's shade. The other had no trace of any stain at all. "Were you expecting a visitor?" I asked, trying hard to sound indifferent. "No, darling, just me here enjoying a quiet, solitary afternoon." She moved quickly to gather the teacups, but I noticed her hands were visibly trembling slightly. I helped her take the gift to my father's study, but something felt profoundly dishonest about the entire interaction. My mother was behaving like someone hiding a massive secret, and I couldn't comprehend what she'd feel the need to hide from me.
Electrical team. 3 weeks before the wedding, I decided to surprise my mother, Vivian, with lunch. She'd been working so relentlessly on the wedding preparations, and I wanted to show my gratitude with her preferred takeout from the famous French patisserie downtown. I used my key to let myself in, announcing as I entered, "Vivian, I brought treats." No reply. I walked through the foyer toward the kitchen, but the atmosphere felt strangely charged. The air held a potent, lingering scent of expensive cologne, and I spotted a high-end men's tweed jacket draped carelessly over the dining chair. Not my father's Henry style at all. It was a sophisticated dark gray, impeccably tailored, the kind my fiancé, Ethan, wore to important board meetings. I found my mother in the kitchen, frantically wiping down the counters. Her hair was messy, her silk blouse was crumpled, and she had that flushed, breathless look of someone who'd been completely taken by surprise. "Vera, what are you doing here?" She seemed genuinely panicked. "I brought lunch," I said slowly, observing the scene. 2 coffee mugs sat in the sink, still radiating heat. 2 plates with crumbs from what looked like a rushed private breakfast. A bottle of Chablis was open on the counter, half consumed, with 2 glasses standing nearby. "I thought you might be hungry," I continued, setting the takeout bag on the counter. "Were you expecting someone?" "No, darling, just me here." Her voice was too upbeat, too quick. "I was just cleaning up from a late breakfast. You know how I despise leaving a mess." But the table was set for 2 with her most prized crystal glassware, the delicate set she only brought out for major events. A single perfect white rose lay across one of the linen napkins, clearly fresh, its velvety petals still pristine. The morning newspaper was folded open precisely to the financial section, something my mother never read, but my fiancé always meticulously checked for stock reports. "Vivian, whose jacket is that in the dining room?" I asked pointedly. She followed my gaze and paled dramatically. "Oh, that's your father's. He must have left it there this morning before his meeting." But my father, Henry, was presiding over a crucial legal briefing across town at that exact moment. I knew because I'd confirmed his schedule the night before, and the jacket was clearly too modern, too slim for my father's traditional taste and heavier frame. "I should probably be going," my mother said quickly, moving toward the jacket. "I have an urgent appointment with the linen supplier in an hour, and you know how congested the roads get." We had firmly confirmed the linen appointment for tomorrow afternoon, not today. I'd entered it into my own digital calendar. I stayed for 20 minutes, watching my mother act with increasing agitation. She kept glancing nervously at the large clock, jumping slightly whenever a vehicle passed outside, and forcing conversation that felt awkward and inauthentic. When I finally left, I noticed she immediately engaged the security alarm behind me, something she never did during daytime hours. That evening, I casually mentioned the jacket to my father, Henry, during dinner at his residence. "Jacket?" he said, sounding genuinely puzzled. "What jacket?" "The charcoal tweed one in the dining room this afternoon. Vivian said it was yours." My parents exchanged a subtle look I couldn't fully decipher. My mother instantly stood up to clear plates that were still half full of food. "Oh, that jacket," my father said carefully. "I borrowed it from someone at my club for the formal wedding photographs next week. I wanted to look more stylish." But my father had never cared about looking stylish in his life, and he was at least 4 stone heavier than whoever owned that perfectly tailored garment.
Over the next few days, I found myself noticing small details I'd previously ignored. The way my mother's face softened and glowed whenever my fiancé Ethan called, how she always seemed to know his demanding schedule better than I did, the fact that she'd started wearing different, more potent perfumes, something musky and expensive rather than her usual light citrus scent. When I mentioned to my fiancé that my mother seemed overwhelmed about the logistics, he was quick to offer assistance. Perhaps I should drop by and help her with some of the financial projections. I know she's been working tirelessly, and I have more availability in my week ahead. I thought it was kind that he wanted to support my mother. I had no idea he was volunteering to spend more precious time alone with his mistress. 1 week after discovering the mysterious jacket, something shifted in my fiancé's demeanor that became impossible to ignore. We'd been constants in each other's lives for 4 years, spending almost every evening together, sharing everything from work pressures to silly inside jokes. Suddenly he became reserved and non-committal in ways that felt completely unnatural. It started on a Tuesday evening when I arrived at his flat with takeout from our favorite Indian restaurant. I had my key, as always, and let myself in, calling his name. Typically, he'd greet me with immediate enthusiasm, asking about my workday and helping me unpack the dinner. Instead, I found him on the phone in his study with the door firmly closed, speaking in barely audible tones. When he finally emerged 20 minutes later, he seemed genuinely shocked to see me. "How long have you been here?" he demanded. "About 20 minutes. I brought dinner." I gestured toward the containers I had arranged neatly on his granite countertop. "Oh, I'm not really hungry tonight. I think I'm coming down with a terrible cold." He did look a bit warm, but not in a sick way, more like someone who'd been caught in a deeply embarrassing situation.
I moved closer to place a hand on his forehead, the way I had countless times throughout our relationship when he wasn't feeling well. Ethan immediately stepped back before I could touch him. "I don't want to pass anything to you," he said quickly. "Perhaps you should just go home tonight." In 4 years together, he'd never once asked me to leave when he was feeling unwell. Usually, he wanted me to stay and look after him. I offered to prepare a herbal tea or drive to the chemist for cold remedies, but he insisted he just needed a quiet sleep. As I gathered my belongings to depart, I noticed a clean whiskey glass on his kitchen counter with distinct lipstick marks around the rim. The color was a deep plum red shade that I'd never worn. I preferred lighter, more subtle stains. When I inquired about it, he quickly glanced over and offered a curt shrug. "Must be the cleaning service. She was here briefly this afternoon." But his cleaning woman was an elderly lady who wore no cosmetics and absolutely wouldn't be sampling expensive whiskey during her shift. The next evening, I tried calling him around 8, our standard check-in time. The call went straight to his digital voicemail. When I tried again an hour later, he answered, but sounded hurried and slightly out of breath. "Hey, I apologize for missing your call earlier. I was at the high-end gym and left my phone in the locked bag." "Which gym?" I asked casually. "I thought your usual place closed at 7 on Wednesdays." There was a noticeable silence before he answered. "I tried that new place across town, the one with the extended hours." I knew the gym he was referring to. It had officially closed down 6 months ago. I'd read about it in the local property journal at work. Friday afternoon, I decided to surprise him at his office with fresh croissants and espresso from the artisan bakery near my office. His executive assistant politely informed me he'd taken a personal leave and wouldn't be back that day. When I called his mobile phone, he answered after multiple rings. "Where are you?" I asked. "I stopped by your office." "Oh, I had to run an urgent errand for my mother. Family matters. You understand." But his mother lived in Monaco and rarely required errands that couldn't be handled by her staff. When I suggested we meet for an early dinner since he was already out, he firmly declined. "I'm quite far north right now. Rain check." That evening, I drove past his flat and saw his expensive sport car clearly visible in the private parking space. Whatever errand he'd been running hadn't taken him far north at all. The most disturbing event happened 3 days later. I went to his apartment Saturday morning with fresh-baked bread and the weekend edition, planning to enjoy a relaxed morning together. Using my key, I found the apartment intensely quiet. I called his name but got no reply. His bedroom door was tightly shut, which was highly unusual. I knocked softly and heard distinct, hurried movement inside, but he didn't answer right away. When he finally opened the door, he was wearing only a bathrobe and completely blocking my view into the room. "I was just stepping out of the shower," he claimed, avoiding eye contact. "Can I come in? I brought breakfast." "Actually, I'm feeling quite unwell again today. Maybe you should grant me some space to recover." For the first time in our long relationship, he actively prevented me from entering his own bedroom. When I tried to step around him to place my handbag on his dresser, as I had hundreds of times before, he physically positioned himself to block my path. "I truly believe I'm contagious. I don't want you to contract whatever this is." As I departed his apartment that morning, feeling deeply confused and wounded, I couldn't shake the sensation that nothing about his recent behavior made any sense. The man I'd been planning to marry was treating me like a total stranger, and I had no explanation why. 2 days before the wedding, I went to my mother Vivian's house to collect some final legal documents my father Henry needed for the ceremony: the marriage license, the expensive wedding bands we'd stored in her personal vault, and the special family crest that had been in our lineage for 3 centuries. It was supposed to be a quick transaction: grab the items and rush back to the hall for the final technical rehearsal. My mother wasn't home, but I had a spare key and knew exactly where everything was stored. The documents were in her bedroom safe, concealed behind a large tapestry that had hung in the same spot since I was a child. As I knelt to open the safe, I noticed something on her nightstand that caused me to freeze. It was a small, sleek tablet device I'd never seen before, placed casually next to her reading glasses and a glass of water.
It was clearly expensive, the kind of device someone gives as a discreet, intimate gift, rather than something you'd purchase for yourself at a common store. I knew I shouldn't have activated it. I knew that even as my fingers hovered over the screen, even as I told myself I was simply curious about my mother's new interest in technology. The first app open was a private messaging client. Dated 4 months ago, exactly when the strange events with my fiancé, Ethan, had started. March 15th. Ethan brought me a gift today, a first edition novel, my favorite, though I never told him that. Somehow he just knew. We talked for hours about architecture, about ambition, about dreams we've never confided in anyone else. I feel like I'm finally awake after years of spiritual slumber. My body went cold as I read those words in my mother, Vivian's, clearly typed text. The gift, the intimate discussion, the exact timing, it all pointed to something I simply could not let myself believe. I scrolled to the next message thread. March 22nd. The inner conflict is consuming me, but I cannot stop thinking about him. When he kissed me today, I felt more vital than I have in 20 years of marriage. We both recognize this is a grievous error, but neither of us seems capable of ending it. He says he's never felt this connection about anyone, that what he has with Vera is merely comfortable, but entirely devoid of real passion. I should tell him to leave, but I'm too selfish. I want to feel desired again. The tablet slipped from my grasp onto the carpet as the absolute horror of what I was reading saturated my mind. My mother was having a prolonged affair with my fiancé, Ethan. The man I was scheduled to marry in 2 days had been secretly sleeping with my mother for months. With trembling hands, I retrieved the tablet and continued scrolling, each text more damning than the last. April 5th. We spent the afternoon together in my private study today while Vera was at a construction site and her father, Henry, was at court. Afterwards, he held me and said he wished circumstances were different, that he wished he'd met me first. I know I should be filled with remorse, but being in his arms felt like the most natural experience in the world. April 18th. We showed me her final dress fitting photos today. She looked so radiant, so pleased, so blindly trusting. I nearly broke and told her the truth, but how can I dismantle her entire life for my own temporary satisfaction? He says we can maintain our connection after the wedding, that marriages of arrangement are common in his elite social circle. I despise myself for even contemplating it. May 10th. We've started planning how to manage our continued relationship after the wedding. He'll have very plausible reasons to visit often. Family gatherings, important holidays, helping with the family's investment portfolio. Vera will never suspect because she trusts us both implicitly. Sometimes I think she's too credulous for her own well-being. Message after message detailed their secret relationship with chilling detail. The remote locations where they met, the elaborate lies they told me, the deceitful future they were planning while I prepared to marry him in complete, utter ignorance. My mother wrote about their intimate encounters with a feverish intensity I'd never heard her express about my father, Henry. About their schemes to continue deceiving me indefinitely, about how my trusting nature made their betrayal incredibly easy to execute. The final entry was dated yesterday, June 20th. Tomorrow is the wedding. He came over this morning for what we both agreed would be our final time together before the ceremony. We were both emotional afterwards, clinging to each other like desperate adolescents. He vowed that after a suitable honeymoon period, we would strategize a way to be together again. I feel like I'm attending my stepdaughter's execution rather than her wedding. But I cannot let him go. I simply will not. I sat on my mother's expensive carpet, completely surrounded by the proof of the most comprehensive betrayal I could possibly conceive. Not only was my fiancé cheating on me, but he was doing it with my own mother. Not only was my mother betraying her husband, but she was betraying her daughter in the most sadistic way possible. They had engineered this deception together, calculated precisely how to continue their affair after my marriage, and documented their entire betrayal in my mother's own digital device. The man I loved, and the woman who had guided me since my youth, had conspired to make me the unknowing third pillar in their despicable love triangle. I left my mother's house with the tablet device tightly secured in my hand and drove straight to the Grand Hotel downtown, where I checked into a room using my father's family name. I couldn't return to my flat. Too many memories of planning our false future together. I couldn't go to my father's, not until I decided exactly what to disclose to him. I desperately needed space to process, to plan, to figure out how to react to the most devastating violation of my trust. I sat on the pristine hotel bed, read through the chat transcripts 3 more times, ensuring I hadn't misinterpreted anything. But there was absolutely no ambiguity in my mother's communications. She detailed their affair with the meticulousness of someone keeping a record for future reference. Dates, specific locations, conversations, deeply intimate moments. Everything was documented with cruel digital clarity. My immediate impulse was to call them both, to scream, to demand frantic explanations. But as I sat in that impersonal hotel room, something deep inside me changed. The shock began to transform into something cold, something laser-focused. They had plotted this betrayal methodically, carefully recording their deception, scheming how to continue manipulating me after my marriage. This was not a temporary lapse in moral judgment. It was a fully calculated campaign of deceit. They absolutely deserved an equally calculated retribution. I spent the entire night strategizing. I made detailed lists, cross-referenced the evidence, and considered every single consequence. By dawn, I knew exactly what I was going to execute. First, I called my office and requested an immediate personal leave. Then, I went to a specialized print service and made hard copies of the most damning chat logs, the ones that explicitly detailed their affair and their explicit plans to continue it after my marriage. I sealed the copies in a discreet envelope and placed them in the hotel safe as irrefutable backup evidence. Next, I contacted the event technician and made a specific request. I told him I wanted to surprise the guests with a special photographic projection during the reception, personal photos and messages from family who couldn't attend. He was thrilled with the concept and readily agreed to set up the large projection system. I spent hours meticulously creating that presentation, along with genuine childhood photos and sweet sentiments from distant relatives. I discreetly embedded high-quality images of my mother's damaging chat transcripts, not enough to completely dominate the presentation, but enough to ensure that every single person at my wedding would understand exactly what kind of contemptible people they were celebrating.
Then I called my father, Henry, not to tell him about the affair yet, that conversation had to happen in person, but to ask him to meet me at the hotel that evening. I told him I needed to urgently discuss a critical change to the ceremony script. When my father arrived, I showed him the tablet and the printouts. I watched his face transform from initial confusion to absolute disbelief to crushing devastation as he read his wife, Vivian's, detailed account of her profound betrayal. He seemed to age 20 years in 20 minutes, his shoulders slumping heavily under the weight of what he was learning. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Since yesterday afternoon. I found the tablet when I went to retrieve the legal documents." We sat in heavy silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to expose them publicly, in front of every person who believes they are honorable, upstanding individuals." My father, who had administered justice based on principles of mercy and due process for 40 years, nodded slowly. "They made their reckless choices. They can live with their irrevocable consequences." We spent the remainder of the evening precisely planning exactly how the revelation would be executed. My father would conduct the ceremony normally until we reached the critical point of the vows. Then, instead of exchanging meaningless promises, I would address the assembled congregation directly. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" my father asked as he prepared to leave. "Once you do this, there is no possibility of retreat." They made that choice for me when they decided to betray everything we are supposed to mean to each other. I'm simply refusing to be a silent victim of their lies. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. For the first time since discovering the truth, I felt like I had regained absolute control over my own narrative. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of 300 people and tell the simple truth. Not their carefully constructed version of reality, but the raw, unedited truth. I wasn't going to quietly disappear or privately confront them in some tearful, closed-door family meeting. They had chosen to make their betrayal elaborate and public by planning to continue it throughout my entire marriage. I woke up on my wedding day with a sense of focused, clear clarity I hadn't experienced in months. No pre-wedding nausea, no nervous excitement, no last-minute anxieties about my gown or hairstyle. Just a cold, focused resolve to see my plan through to the end. I ordered room service, grilled salmon, asparagus, and strong coffee, and ate slowly while reviewing my declaration one final time. I'd composed it the night before, timing it to last precisely 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Long enough to deliver all the essential facts, short enough to finish before anyone could intervene and silence me. At 9 a.m., my 3 Engineers Guild colleagues arrived at the hotel for the final preparations. 3 women I'd known since university, all thrilled to be part of what they believed was the happiest day of my life. I smiled and chatted with them as they helped me into my sapphire-blue velvet gown,
applied my subtle makeup, and arranged my hair in the elaborate chignon my mother, Vivian, had insisted upon. "You look completely poised and serene," said my chief project officer, fastening my great-grandmother's antique silver brooch around my neck. "I've never seen you so tranquil before a major presentation." She was absolutely correct. I felt profoundly at peace with the ensuing confrontation. The wedding photographer arrived at 10:30 to capture the before-ceremony images. I posed for the stage shots, putting on my shoes, holding my bouquet, gazing meditatively out the window. All the images that were meant to document a bride's anticipation and pure joy. Instead, they were documenting my final preparations for a public execution. At 11:30, my father, Henry, arrived to escort me to the grand hall. The moment he saw me in my full bridal attire, his composure briefly faltered. "Vera, you are under no obligation to do this," he said quietly, taking my hands in his. "We can cancel it right now. Inform everyone you've fallen ill or that you've had a change of heart. No one would blame you for that." "I must do this," I replied, straightening his expensive tie with completely steady hands. "They planned their betrayal. I get to plan my announcement." He nodded, understanding that this transcended merely terminating a relationship. This was about asserting my self-respect and refusing to be a puppet in someone else's drama. In the chauffeured vehicle on the way to the hall, I carefully tucked the copied digital transcripts into my bouquet, securing them between the irises with a gold thread. My something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and something true.
Then I called my father, Henry, not to tell him about the affair yet. That conversation had to happen in person, but to ask him to meet me at the hotel that evening. I told him I needed to urgently discuss a critical change to the ceremony script. When my father arrived, I showed him the tablet and the printouts. I watched his face transform from initial confusion to absolute disbelief to crushing devastation as he read his wife, Vivian's, detailed account of her profound betrayal. He seemed to age 20 years and 20 minutes, his shoulders slumping heavily under the weight of what he was learning. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Since yesterday afternoon. I found the tablet when I went to retrieve the legal documents." We sat in heavy silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to expose them publicly, in front of every person who believes they are honorable, upstanding individuals." My father, who had administered justice based on principles of mercy and due process for 40 years, nodded slowly. "They made their reckless choices," he said. "They can live with the irrevocable consequences." We spent the remainder of the evening precisely planning exactly how the revelation would be executed. My father would conduct the ceremony normally until we reached the critical point of the vows. Then, instead of exchanging meaningless promises, I would address the assembled congregation directly. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" my father asked as he prepared to leave. "Once you do this, there is no possibility of retreat." They made that choice for me when they decided to betray everything we are supposed to mean to each other, I replied. I'm simply refusing to be a silent victim of their lies. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. For the first time since discovering the truth, I felt like I had regained absolute control over my own narrative. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of 300 people and tell the simple truth. Not their carefully constructed version of reality, but the raw, unedited truth. I wasn't going to quietly disappear or privately confront them in some tearful, closed-door family meeting. They had chosen to make their betrayal elaborate and public by planning to continue it throughout my entire marriage. I woke up on my wedding day with a sense of focused, clear clarity I hadn't experienced in months. No pre-wedding nausea, no nervous excitement, no last-minute anxieties about my gown or hairstyle. Just a cold, focused resolve to see my plan through to the end. I ordered room service, grilled salmon, asparagus, and strong coffee, and ate slowly while reviewing my declaration one final time. I'd composed it the night before, timing it to last precisely 3 minutes and 15 seconds, long enough to deliver all the essential facts, short enough to finish before anyone could intervene and silence me. The hall looked exactly as my mother, Vivian, had envisioned. Deep red peonies everywhere, massive candelabras flickering along the aisle, soft classical music filling the immense space. 300 guests completely filled the seats, dressed in their most formal attire, eagerly discussing the magnificent ceremony they were about to witness. I stood in the small antechamber, watching through the partially open doors as my mother, Vivian, took her privileged seat in the front row. She was wearing the emerald green gown we'd chosen together, delicately touching her eyes with a silk scarf as if she were profoundly moved by the sacred occasion. The act was perfect. The image of a proud maternal figure on her stepdaughter's wedding day. My fiancé, Ethan, stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, nervously adjusting his cufflinks as he waited for me to appear. From this distance, he looked like every woman's dream catch. Handsome, professionally successful, from a distinguished family. The congregation likely assumed he was nervous about the monumental commitment he was undertaking. They had absolutely no idea he'd already made his real commitment to someone else. 5 minutes, whispered the highly organized wedding coordinator, an efficient woman in a black suit who'd managed hundreds of elite events in this venue. Are you prepared? I looked at myself in the full-length mirror one final time. The woman staring back at me looked beautiful, resolute, and ready for anything. My gown was perfect, my makeup flawless, my hair arranged exactly as planned. I looked like a bride who was about to have the wedding of her wildest dreams. Instead, I was about to give 300 people an unforgettable true crime story. I am ready, I told the coordinator. My father, Henry, appeared beside me, offering his arm. His expression was serious but resolute. He'd spent the morning mentally preparing himself for what was about to happen, and I could see he was ready to offer his complete support. Last chance to reconsider, he murmured, as the music intensified to signal the processional was imminent. I've never been more certain of anything in my entire life, I replied. The massive doors opened completely, and I saw the entire congregation turn their heads to look at me. 300 faces filled with expectation and delight, ready to celebrate what they thought was a beautiful love story. In the front row, my mother pressed her scarf to her eyes, performing her role flawlessly. At the altar, my fiancé, Ethan, smiled, that powerful smile that had once made me believe in romantic destiny. I took my first measured step down the aisle, my father's steady presence a rock beside me. With each step, I could feel the presence of the transcripts hidden in my bouquet, the evidence that would violently shatter the illusion everyone was existing in, including myself, until 2 days ago. The bridal chorus played, and guests smiled and offered small nods as I passed. Some delicately wiped away tears, thinking they were witnessing a moment of true love. Others took photos, eager to capture what they believed was unadulterated happiness. They were about to witness something entirely different. Not a wedding, but a public indictment. Not a celebration of love, but a brutal exposure of betrayal. Not the beginning of a marriage, but the definitive end of a scheme. As I approached the altar, I caught my fiancé's eye. He was looking at me with what appeared to be genuine fondness, as if he'd somehow managed to convince himself that marrying me while planning to resume his affair with my mother was an acceptable act of dual love rather than pure cruelty. In 30 seconds, his entire meticulously constructed world was going to violently collapse. I reached the altar and took my designated place beside my fiancé, who leaned over to whisper, "You look incredibly breathtaking." His voice carried real warmth, as if he'd completely isolated his moral failure from the gravity of this moment. My father began the ceremony with his usual solemn grace and dignity. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the solemn union of 2 lives in matrimony." His voice was perfectly steady, giving absolutely no indication of the crisis that was about to unfold. The congregation settled into their plush seats, smiling and attentive. I could see my mother in the front row, beaming with what appeared to be genuine maternal pride. My fiancé's family filled the opposite wing, looking highly satisfied with their son's choice of a bride. Everyone was executing their assigned roles perfectly. My father continued through the opening formal prayers and selected readings, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years in law and judgment. When we reached the section about the sacred nature of marriage and the essential importance of honesty between partners, I saw him glance at me, almost imperceptibly. It was the signal. "Now," my father said, his voice taking on a slightly more profound tone, "before we proceed with the sacred vows, Vera has a statement she would like to share with all of you." A wave of surprise rippled through the congregation. This was not a component of the formal ceremony script, and guests began to sit up straighter, intensely curious about the nature of this interruption. I turned to face the assembled crowd, my heavy bouquet steady in my grasp. 300 faces looked back at me expectantly, thinking they were about to hear a poetic personal declaration or perhaps a formal tribute to deceased relatives. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the hall's magnificent acoustics. "I know many of you traveled great distances to celebrate what you believed would be the happiest day of my life." I paused deliberately, letting that shift in tense register. A few people exchanged concerned glances, sensing that something was fundamentally wrong with my composure. "Unfortunately, I discovered irrefutable evidence 2 days ago that changes absolutely everything." I reached into my bouquet and carefully withdrew the digital chat transcripts, unfolding them precisely. My mother has been keeping a highly detailed record of her 4-month-long affair with my fiancé. The silence that followed was physically heavy. Not a single cough, not a shuffle of clothing, not even the sound of background breathing. 300 people sat completely motionless in their seats, slowly processing the shocking information they'd just heard. My fiancé's face drained white, then flushed a deep red, then returned instantly to a sickly pale. "Vera, what in God's name are you doing?" he whispered urgently. I ignored him and continued, reading directly from the digital chat transcripts. "March. He brought me a gift today. A first edition novel, my favorite, though I never told him that. We talked for hours about architecture, about ambition, about dreams we've never confided in anyone else." My mother, Vivian, half rose from her seat, her face a mask of paralyzed horror. "Vera, cease this immediately." "April 5th, I continued reading, my voice gaining strength with each word. "We spent the afternoon together in my private study today while Vera was at a construction site and her father was at court. Afterwards, he held me and said he wished circumstances were different, that he wished he'd met me first." Sharp gasps erupted throughout the hall. People began turning to stare directly at my mother, Vivian, and my fiancé, Ethan, their faces reflecting shock, profound disgust, and intense fascination in equal measure. My fiancé lunged to grab my arm. "Vera, what are you doing? You are making a massive mistake. Let me explain." I violently pulled away from him and read the final, damning entry. "June 20th, tomorrow is the wedding. We were both emotional afterwards, clinging to each other like desperate adolescents. He promised that after a suitable honeymoon period, we would strategize a way to be together again. I feel like I'm attending my stepdaughter's execution instead of her wedding." The hall immediately erupted in absolute chaos. People were standing, shouting, pulling out their expensive phones to frantically record the unfolding drama. My fiancé's mother shrieked, "This is an outrageous lie!" My mother's acquaintances stared at her in horrified silence as she collapsed back into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "They planned to continue their affair throughout my marriage," I announced loudly over the noise. "This tablet documents their entire betrayal in my mother's own words. Every lie they told me, every deception they planned, every moment they chose their selfish, shallow desires over my well-being." I deliberately placed the transcripts on the altar and faced my fiancé directly. "Did you honestly think I was too simple to figure it out eventually?
Too trusting to notice the blatant signs? Too weak to do anything about it? He opened his mouth to speak, but no coherent words came out. He looked like a defeated man watching his entire life's foundation implode in real time. I turned back to the congregation one final, definitive time. The chaos had momentarily settled into a horrified, tense silence as people waited to see what dramatic act I would perform next. I want every single person here to understand this, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. I could have handled this discreetly. I could have quietly called off the wedding, let them save face, protect their reputations, and maintain family harmony. But they chose to meticulously document their betrayal. They chose to plan a future of continued, cynical deception. They chose to make me an unknowing, humiliated participant in their sick game. I walked down the altar steps, my heavy wedding gown trailing behind me like a symbolic train. So I chose to respond publicly. Everyone who thought they were celebrating a beautiful love story deserves to know they were actually enabling a cruel, calculated deception. My mother finally found a weak voice. Vera, please, I can find a way to explain everything. You don't understand the circumstances. I understand perfectly, I cut her off sharply. I understand that you betrayed your stepdaughter, your marriage, and every single value you claim to stand for. I understand that he betrayed our relationship, his promises to me, and the genuine trust of everyone who believed in him. Most importantly, I understand that I deserve far better than both of you. I turned to my father, Henry, who had watched the entire scene unfold with quiet, absolute dignity. Father, thank you for supporting me today. It means everything. He nodded, his eyes filled with immense pride and quiet sorrow in equal measure. I began walking back down the aisle, my head held high as I passed 300 stunned guests. Some tried to reach out to me with hushed words of support. Others sat in stunned silence, but most were already pulling out their phones to share the incredible spectacle they just witnessed. My fiancé's mother shrieked, "This is an outrageous lie!" My mother's acquaintances stared at her in horrified silence as she collapsed back into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. They planned to continue their affair throughout my marriage, I announced loudly over the noise. This tablet documents their entire betrayal in my mother's own words. Every lie they told me, every deception they planned, every moment they chose their selfish, shallow desires over my well-being. I deliberately placed the transcripts on the altar and faced my fiancé directly. Did you honestly think I was too simple to figure it out eventually? Too trusting to notice the blatant signs? Too weak to do anything about it? He opened his mouth to speak, but no coherent words came out. He looked like a defeated man watching his entire life's foundation implode in real time. I turned back to the congregation one final, definitive time. The chaos had momentarily settled into a horrified, tense silence as people waited to see what dramatic act I would perform next. I want every single person here to understand this, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. I could have handled this discreetly. I could have quietly called off the wedding, let them save face, protect their reputations, and maintain family harmony. But they chose to meticulously document their betrayal. They chose to plan a future of continued, cynical deception. They chose to make me an unknowing, humiliated participant in their sick game. I walked down the altar steps, my heavy wedding gown trailing behind me like a symbolic train. So I chose to respond publicly. Everyone who thought they were celebrating a beautiful love story deserves to know they were actually enabling a cruel, calculated deception. My mother finally found a weak voice. Vera, please, I can find a way to explain everything. You don't understand the circumstances.
I understand perfectly, I cut her off sharply. I understand that you betrayed your stepdaughter, your marriage, and every single value you claim to stand for. I understand that he betrayed our relationship, his promises to me, and the genuine trust of everyone who believed in him. Most importantly, I understand that I deserve far better than both of you. I turned to my father, Henry, who had watched the entire scene unfold with quiet, absolute dignity. Father, thank you for supporting me today. It means everything. He nodded, his eyes filled with immense pride and quiet sorrow in equal measure. I began walking back down the aisle, my head held high as I passed 300 stunned guests. Some tried to reach out to me with hushed words of support. Others sat in stunned silence, but most were already pulling out their phones to share the incredible spectacle they just witnessed. My fiancé's mother shrieked, "This is an outrageous lie!" My mother's acquaintances stared at her in horrified silence as she collapsed back into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. They planned to continue their affair throughout my marriage, I announced loudly over the noise. This tablet documents their entire betrayal in my mother's own words. Every lie they told me, every deception they planned, every moment they chose their selfish, shallow desires over my well-being. I deliberately placed the transcripts on the altar and faced my fiancé directly. Did you honestly think I was too simple to figure it out eventually? Too trusting to notice the blatant signs? Too weak to do anything about it? He opened his mouth to speak, but no coherent words came out. He looked like a defeated man watching his entire life's foundation implode in real time.
My mother's carefully cultivated reputation as a devoted wife of a high court judge crumbled overnight. My fiancé's law firm began receiving urgent inquiries about his moral character and ethical judgment. Their betrayal, which they thought was a private, secret affair, became a devastating public scandal that followed them across the country. The wedding that was supposed to be the glorious beginning of my perfect life instead became the pivotal moment I chose to value myself over everyone else's shallow comfort. I learned that sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do is firmly refuse to be a casualty of other people's pure selfishness. And for the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to discover who I authentically was when I wasn't frantically trying to please people who profoundly didn't deserve my devotion. 6 months later, I was living in a modern apartment in Dublin, Ireland, over 2,000 kilometers away from the wreckage of my former life. I'd accepted a chief architect position at a small but highly prestigious design studio that specialized in innovative, sustainable urban planning, projects about resilience, transformation, and finding structural integrity in unexpected places. My new life was simple, but deeply fulfilling. I worked with colleagues who designed complex structures, making difficult ethical choices. I lived entirely alone for the first time since university and discovered I genuinely adored my own company. My apartment had huge windows, polished concrete floors, and technical design books stacked floor to ceiling. I'd furnished it completely according to my own minimalist taste, no input from well-meaning family members or deceitful partners who thought they knew better than I did what would truly make me happy. The first 3 months had been inherently challenging. The story of my wedding revelation had followed me relentlessly online, making job networking feel impossible and initial interviews profoundly awkward. But eventually, people stopped recognizing me as that woman from the viral wedding video, and I could build a professional reputation based entirely on my work rather than my personal drama. My father had visited twice, both times looking healthier and more at peace than I had seen him in years. He'd formally filed for divorce from my mother a week after the wedding, citing irreconcilable differences and egregious betrayal of marital vows. The divorce was officially finalized 4 months later, and he'd since started spending time with a kind, intelligent colleague from the High Court, someone who genuinely appreciated his integrity rather than cynically exploiting it. "I owe you my thanks, Vera.
he told me during his second visit, as we sat in my favorite quiet cafe overlooking the River Liffey. You gave me the courage to admit that my marriage had been making me profoundly unhappy for years. I was so focused on the archaic idea that honorable people work through everything that I never asked myself whether I deserved to be happy. I'd received exactly 3 communication attempts from my mother in 6 months. The first was a 10-paged typed letter delivered 2 weeks after the wedding, filled with verbose justifications, flimsy excuses, and pathetic requests for forgiveness that felt more about alleviating her intense guilt than my genuine healing. I read it once and immediately shredded it. The second was a frantic voicemail on my birthday, sobbing and begging me to call her back so she could explain everything properly. I deleted it without listening to the entire message. The third was a bulky package containing old family photo albums and some expensive jewelry she thought I might want, along with a note saying she understood why I was intensely angry, but hoped someday I could find it in my heart to forgive her. I donated the expensive jewelry to a local women's shelter and kept one single photo. A picture of me and my father at my university graduation, both of us beaming with genuine, unadulterated joy. It was the only family photo where my mother wasn't present, and therefore the only one that didn't make me feel physically ill to look at. My former fiancé, Ethan, had attempted contact more frequently and with increasing desperation. He'd tried calling, texting, appearing at my old apartment building, and even having mutual acquaintances reach out on his behalf. All of his pathetic messages followed the exact same pattern: initial apologies followed by weak explanations about how the affair just happened, then anger when I didn't respond, then desperate bargaining about how we could work through this terrible ordeal together. His final message, sent 4 months after the wedding, was a rambling email about how he'd finally realized he'd made the biggest, most irreversible mistake of his life and was willing to do literally anything to win me back. He claimed he'd ended things with my mother immediately after the ceremony and was in therapy to understand why he'd betrayed me so utterly and completely. I read the entire self-serving message, then permanently blocked his email address without responding. He didn't deserve my forgiveness, my anger, or my precious attention. He deserved to be entirely forgotten. The most surprising aspect of my new life was how little I genuinely missed either of them. I'd fully expected to feel sad, intensely lonely, or constantly angry most of the time. Instead, I felt immense relief. The constant low-level anxiety I'd carried throughout my entire engagement, always wondering if I was good enough, smart enough, interesting enough, had vanished completely. I no longer had to perform the exhausting role of the perfect daughter or the ideal trophy fiancé. I could just be Vera, figuring out what I wanted without anyone else's unsolicited input or desperate approval. 1 year after my wedding that never happened, I stood in front of 300 professionals at the Dublin Convention Centre, delivering a keynote address titled "Choosing Uncomfortable Truth Over Comfortable Lies: Why Self-Respect is Never a Selfish Act." The speaking engagement had come about entirely unexpectedly. A prominent international women's leadership forum had contacted me after reading an essay I'd published in a National Architectural Review magazine about recognizing profound betrayal and refusing to become a willing victim. They wanted someone to talk about making ethical, difficult choices in the face of personal catastrophe. A year ago, I genuinely believed my life was perfect. I had a highly successful career, a magnificent wedding planned, and what I believed was a loving family supporting me. I also had a fiancé who was having a secret affair with my mother, but I was too trusting to see the structural fault. When I discovered their betrayal 2 days before my wedding, I had a fundamental choice. I could handle it privately, quietly, in a way that protected their reputations and maintained a false sense of family peace, or I could choose honesty. Messy, painful, brutal public honesty that would expose the truth and force everyone to confront the ugly reality: I paused, looking out at the sea of attentive faces, women of all ages who had faced their own moments of crisis and pivotal decision. I chose truth, and it was the most liberating choice I have ever made. I spent the next 45 minutes sharing what I'd learned about absolute self-respect, about the crucial difference between genuine kindness and toxic enabling, about the profound courage it takes to disappoint people who clearly don't have your best interests at heart.
The response was astonishing. A standing ovation followed by a long queue of women wanting to share their own personal stories of choosing difficult truths over comfortable, dishonest lies. After the event, I drove home to my apartment where I'd built a new life that was entirely my own design. No compromises, no committee decisions, no trying to be the person others desperately wanted me to be. I had houseplants I'd chosen because I liked them, books arranged according to my own unconventional system, food in my refrigerator that reflected my actual tastes rather than someone else's preferences. I'd started dating again 3 months ago, carefully, selectively, with clear, firm boundaries about what I would and wouldn't accept. The man I was seeing was a history professor at Trinity College who deeply appreciated my fierce independence and had never once suggested I was too intense or too demanding for knowing my own worth. My career was flourishing in ways it never had when I was planning my life around someone else's schedules and priorities. I'd been promoted twice and was now seriously considering starting my own specialized architectural consulting business. I'd also begun writing a book about my experience. Not a memoir of victimhood, but a practical, structural guide for women who found themselves in similarly devastating situations. My relationship with my father had never been stronger. He'd remarried 6 months ago to the intelligent colleague from his congregation, and their quiet happiness was a genuine joy to witness. He'd called me the morning after his wedding to tell me how proud he was of the immense courage I'd shown, how my choice to stand up for myself had given him the permission to do the same. As for my mother and former fiancé, I occasionally received updates through mutual acquaintances. Their sordid affair had lasted exactly 3 weeks after my wedding revelation. Apparently, reality was significantly less appealing than their destructive fantasy. My mother had moved to Manchester to live near her estranged sister, completely unable to face the social and legal consequences of her actions in our hometown. My former fiancé had resigned from his law firm and moved to London, supposedly to start afresh, but more likely to escape the toxic reputation he'd permanently earned. Neither of them had succeeded in rebuilding the lives they'd recklessly destroyed in pursuit of their selfish desires. The affair that had seemed worth risking everything for had instantly evaporated under public scrutiny, leaving them both alone with the immense consequences of their choices. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy about their outcomes. They had become utterly irrelevant to my story the moment I chose to value myself over their pathetic comfort. Sitting in my apartment that evening, surrounded by design books I loved and future plans I'd made independently, I realized that my revenge had never been about destroying them. It had been about fiercely refusing to be destroyed by them. My revenge was this life, free, authentic, and entirely my own creation. My revenge was discovering that I was fundamentally stronger, more interesting, and more capable than I'd ever known when I was desperately trying to be perfect for people who didn't deserve my perfection. The woman who had stood at that altar 1 year ago, utterly devastated and betrayed, had been transformed into someone who would never again accept less than she absolutely deserved.
So that was my reckoning. Leaving that cathedral in my wedding dress was the scariest but most liberating step I've ever taken. It proved that choosing self-respect over keeping the peace is always the right call. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Have you ever had to choose a difficult truth over a comfortable lie? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of my life.